Hi, I'm MissPlissken, and today I'm building the Royal Palace of Amsterdam. This was sort of a request build. I had a request to build the Dutch royal residence, and there's technically 3, and being sort of selfish here, I did not ask for further clarification because I wanted to build the one I've actually been to. So, sorry, if you wanted to see a different build, I can absolutely put the other royal residences back on my to-do list, but trust me, this is a good one. The palace has a very interesting history that began its life during the Dutch Golden Age as a town hall. Construction began in 1648 and was inaugurated in 1655, making it the largest, grandest building in the Dutch Republic from that time period. It was even given the nickname of the 8th wonder of the world, which might seem like a stretch, but for as restrained as the exterior is, I promise you the interior is an absolute masterpiece. I only hope to do it a tiny bit of justice. Broadly speaking, the town hall was designed in a classical style, aiming to evoke the power and superiority of the Roman Empire that was, and still to this day, is super popular for Western government buildings. It was intended to show the status of the Netherlands as an absolute powerhouse of cultural and economic power, but more importantly, was intended to reflect those good old Roman democratic ideals of the Dutch Republic. But more specifically, this is a great example of Dutch Baroque architecture. I spoke a bit about Baroque architecture in general in my Georgian Manor video, about how styles of Baroque varied wildly depending on the place, and it's generally associated with very showy, ostentatious ornament. However, as with most everything, there are exceptions, and while I'm not going to say Dutch Baroque is plain, I will say it's more reserved and a more restrained sort of elegance that I think actually works really well for municipal buildings. The popularity of this more reserved version of Baroque was driven largely from the Protestant Reformation and turning away from the extremely decorative Baroque styles associated with Catholicism. So let me set the stage here for why this building should impress the heck out of you. A couple of practical points. A good portion of the Netherlands is low-lying, marshy, sandy soil, which requires deep piles to form the foundation. This means that to start construction on the town hall, 13,659 long wooden logs were driven deep into the ground. This sort of thing is still used today to construct buildings on squishy land, but it's much more impressive thinking about the ordeal of it in 1648. Another practical point is stone. If you've traveled around Amsterdam, you probably notice a lot of brick buildings, because there really wasn't much in terms of locally available stone, so building this out of stone was right off the bat a way to make the building say, "Look at me, I'm important." Another thing setting this building apart from your average Amsterdam building is you see a lot of very narrow buildings, and that's because building tax was calculated based on the width of a building's facade. So naturally, people would build really narrow but very long buildings. And I'm not sure if this sort of tax would have even applied to a civic building such as the town hall, but regardless, it certainly would have stood out by being so wide. And the last little bit of practical consideration I want to point out is that at the time, the Netherlands was just coming out of a Spanish rebellion, and okay, so I guess rebellion isn't quite the right word. It was the 80 Years' War, so kind of a big deal. And so the history of the Netherlands is so dang complicated. Please forgive any and all sweeping generalizations and simplifications, including but not limited to what I even mean when I say the Netherlands. Is it the Netherlands? The Northern Netherlands? The Low Countries? The Kingdom of Holland? The Dutch Republic? This general area was called a lot of things over the years, and I try to keep track correctly, but for, like, the sake of storytelling clarity, I think I may have fudged a few. All right, pedantic disclaimer out of the way, I'm going to try to set the stage. Okay, so the Union of Utrecht was signed in 1579, and I know you're thinking, what the heck, we're going backwards in time almost 80 years? But follow me here, I promise I have a point. So the Union of Utrecht unified 7 provinces of the Netherlands against the Spanish, who controlled that whole area at the time. And I cannot overstate how important the Netherlands was strategically. The amount of trade controlled by the Netherlands was just unparalleled, even by today's standards adjusting for inflation. More on that later. Back to the Spanish. Okay, so the Dutch weren't overly fond of the Spanish, but the general sentiment at the time was surprisingly not so hostile to Spain. The Dutch were fairly okay with Spanish rule, but the Spanish made two critical mistakes that turned the Dutch against them. One, the Spanish were trying really hard to impose a large centralized government, which meant imposing their own taxes and taking money out of local areas to be spent on Spanish wars elsewhere. And two, the Spanish persecuted the growing number of Protestants, which, rude guys, come on. Because you see, Spain was part of the Holy Roman Empire, meaning super friggin' Catholic. And the Protestant Reformation was sweeping through the Netherlands, and since the King of Spain wasn't hearing any of this live and let live religious coexistence business that William of Orange was trying to sell him, that brings us to the 80 Years' War. William of Orange, who may sound familiar, he's kind of a big deal, founder of the Dutch royal family, led the unified Dutch provinces during the war in the early years, and eventually the Dutch managed to wrestle the 7 provinces out of Spanish control with the Peace of Westphalia treaties signed in 1648. And look at that, we're back to 1648, the year that construction on the town hall started. See, I knew I'd get there eventually. But back to the actual point I was trying to make, the independent Dutch Republic is a baby at this point. The Dutch didn't really have what you'd call a national identity. Culturally speaking, identity was very locally driven, very province-centric, and they didn't have a large established centralized government yet, or a monarchy, or a large aristocracy that went around building civic buildings. So this town hall was really supposed to be that sort of statement piece of a republic. As far as statement pieces go, the facade of the town hall is fairly understated, but the details are very exciting to me. The festoons on the exterior, those little garland details between the windows, are actually a bunch of different designs rather than one copy-pasted design. They're also chock full of symbolism, which is basically the theme for any and all decorative elements of this building. I swear I don't think there's anything in this building that's just pretty, it's also gotta have meaning. A lot of the sculpture represents how important trade was to the Dutch Republic, with a lot of symbolism for different parts of the globe, cartography, bounties of the land and sea, that sort of thing. And of course, since this town hall was basically like an all-in-one municipal building, which included the criminal court, prison, police office, tax office, bank, armory, mayor's office, magistrate, treasury, and city council, there's also a lot of peace and justice-related symbolism. There are sculptural representations of all the planets near the most appropriate office. For example, Mercury, holding a purse, is supposed to represent commerce and is stationed outside what was originally the treasury. There's also a lot of "we're awesome, we're the center of the universe" type symbolism, which normally I'd think, wow, okay, calm down, get over yourself. However, in this case, I think it might have actually been a tiny bit true. So when I said earlier that the amount of trade controlled by the Netherlands was just unparalleled, I was not being hyperbolic, and I was talking specifically about the VOC, probably more familiar as the Dutch East India Company. This was the world's first joint stock company, and probably the first multinational corporation, and the wealthiest company ever, at its peak worth about $7.8 trillion adjusted for inflation. For comparison, the world's current richest company based on market cap, Apple, is worth a measly $2 trillion. So yeah, I do wish I had the custom content in order to really do the sculptural symbolism justice. I tried to just, cobble together what I had to kind of give the suggestion of an opulent civic center befitting Amsterdam in the Dutch Golden Age. But how about we just don't look too closely at what I've done? Like, back away and squint a little bit. I'm actually really happy with how the Tribunal Room turned out, though. This room in real life is so weird. I've never seen anything like it, and it was by far my favorite room in the palace. It was used as almost like a little mini courtroom where death sentences were proclaimed in basically a ritualistic sort of fashion, and it's so oddly small, but has a really tall barrel vaulted ceiling, and the whole thing is made of marble, so it gives me the overall impression of being a crypt. This whole room is wall-to-wall statuary and relief sculptures. There's a lot of symbolism in the statuary. There's Lady Justice, depictions of good judgment, discretion, and fidelity. There's grieving women with their heads in their hands. There's a lot of religious iconography too, like apples and serpents representing the fall of man. But another weird feature of this room is there are so many windows in it. The room is 2 stories tall, And in the second story, there are windows into what would have been the office of the mayors, so they could like watch the death sentences. The whole thing is very odd. So how it was set up is there are marble steps on one side of the room where the sheriffs and the magistrates would sit, and then directly across from the door is what kind of looks like a solid marble witness stand, but it's actually a little desk where the councilman's secretary would sit and read out the death sentence, all while the mayors would watch from above. Then, after the death sentence was given, everybody went upstairs for a prayer, then the condemned was hung on a gallows. I mean, yeah, the crypt similarities must be intentional. In the basement, there are prison cells and a torture chamber, which is apparently now a staff cafeteria. And in the ceiling of the torture chamber are very beautifully carved torture instruments. How lovely. I wasn't entirely sure what to do with the basement, so I made some prison cells, basically sparse bedrooms, and I put the kitchen and some bathrooms down there. Nothing fancy, nothing exciting, but it makes the whole thing functional if you wanted to use this as a house. I can't even comprehend how laggy this lot would be to play on. I tried to decorate with a lot of the same objects over and over again because I've heard that the variety of objects causes more lag than the number of objects. However, this lot is so absurdly huge and just so over the top, it's going to be laggy no matter what. This is far and away the most expensive, time-consuming, and just all-around excessive build I've ever done. One surprising thing I was happy about with, though, was a lot of the set dressing in Brychester looks surprisingly Dutch, which is part of the reason why I chose this lot to build the town hall. I don't know if that's intentional. I kind of thought this world was supposed to have more of an American Ivy League town vibe, but these narrow brick houses with the prominent front-facing gables could very well be modeled after some of the Amsterdam Canal houses I've seen. Okay, now I've got to go on a gable tangent really quick. I can't just mention Amsterdam Canal houses and not. These narrow gabled houses are super common in Amsterdam, but can also be found all over the Netherlands and Belgium. The gable on the front serves a practical purpose of providing an anchor point for a winch to haul up furniture to the upper stories because, again, crazy narrow buildings, and that just makes for a nightmare furniture moving scenario. The gables come in all sorts of styles, from the simple triangular gable to stepped gables, which is really more of a Gothic architecture feature and not so specifically Dutch, but anyway, there's also spout gables that popped up in the 1600s, and then later more fanciful neck and bell gables that often had a bit of Louis XV detailing. Okay, so that's all for my gable tangent. So timeline-wise, the Dutch are living it up in the Dutch Golden Age. They are undisputed world economic leaders. But the Dutch Golden Age was really so much more than that. The region was overall very tolerant of outsider intellectual ideas, and that fostered a lot of innovation in science, math, and philosophy. René Descartes' most important works were published while he lived in Amsterdam. The pendulum clock, the discovery of Saturn's rings, the discovery of bacteria, and advancements in hydraulic engineering all came out of the Dutch Golden Age. But I'd venture to guess the most famous thing to come out of the Dutch Golden Age would be the art. The wealthy middle class, plus the lack of Catholic Church art patronage, spawned a huge movement of sort of slice-of-life paintings called genre paintings, and various secular subject matter like still life, landscape, seascapes, and that most characteristic genre of Dutch Golden Age painting, the group portrait. The most famous possibly being The Night Watch by Rembrandt, though my personal fave is definitely Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaas Tulp, which is admittedly a bit icky, but there's something about such grim subject matter being depicted with such beauty that really gets to me. I love the Dutch masters. So, where were we? The Golden Age. How lovely for them. Surely it'll last. And surely at this point you're wondering, why is it that this building is called the Royal Palace of Amsterdam when I've literally only referred to it as a town hall? That's ominous foreshadowing. We've come to 1672, the fittingly named disaster year. What is widely considered to be the end of the Dutch Golden Age. Disaster year is such a great name, by the way. I like that it's just straight up. This is a disaster. I think at this point we can probably all relate to a disaster year. So, okay, the disaster year had England, France, Cologne, and Munster all declare war on the Netherlands. It didn't go great, but blah, 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 fighting treaties, the usual. The Dutch Republic itself, meanwhile, was struggling between the monarchists and the regents, monarchy or oligarchy, pick your poison, and by the end of a bunch of shenanigans, I cannot believe how much I'm glossing over here, but bear with me, you've got a Dutch economy that never fully recovered and a deep-seated mistrust of the French. So much so that 16 years later, when the Catholic French-supporting James II came into power in England, the Netherlands just straight up said, no, and deposed him, replacing him with his daughter, Mary II, who conveniently was married to the nephew of William III of Orange. Politics. I don't want to go into all the details of every war, alliance, treaty, and political machination that happened between the disaster year of 1672 and 1806, but suffice it to say, the French and the Dutch had some serious beef. In 1806, France, namely Napoleon Bonaparte, overthrew the Dutch government, declared it the Kingdom of Holland, and just gave it to his brother. Honestly, politics is weird. So much nepotism. Any hoot. So his brother Louis needed a fancy place to live in his newfangled Kingdom of Holland, right? So he just decided to make the Amsterdam town hall his palace because it was fancy. Not fancy enough for his French wife, though, who also happened to be his stepniece, which, ew. Anyway, rumor has it that she hated Amsterdam, thought the whole place was smelly and terrible, and never spent any time at all there with her husband. It might have been more that she hated her husband rather than the palace, but that's none of my business. But to both Louis's credit and ultimate downfall, he did try to learn Dutch, make his whole court Dutch, and rule the Kingdom of Holland as an independent nation, not just a French puppet state, which is ultimately why Napoleon forced him to abdicate just 4 years into his reign, and he lived out the rest of his life in exile in Austria. But worry not, the Kingdom of Holland was turned over to the Dutch just 3 years later in 1813, and William I decided he just liked the idea of keeping the town hall as a palace. Today, the palace is still used in official functions, state dinners, lodging for the VIPs and such, but it's open to the public as much as possible, which is why, if it's open when you're in town, you've got to see it. It's amazing, and it's tied to so much Dutch history. Really a treat if you're into architecture and history. We're coming up to the end of the build. My apologies for the absolute speed run of 500 years of Dutch history. And let me know in the comments if you have any building or architecture style requests. If you're interested in art, architecture, and history, please consider subscribing. I have many more of these videos planned. Thank you for all of the build suggestions, and thank you so much for watching.